Today, Denton looks like a city that was destined to grow. New neighborhoods stretch across former farmland, traffic moves along major highways, universities bring thousands of students into the city, and the population has climbed dramatically. The U.S. Census recorded 139,869 residents in 2020, while the Census Bureau estimated 169,431 people by July 2025. But Denton was not always a growing North Texas city. Just over a century ago, it was still a relatively small community whose economy depended heavily on agriculture and its role as the seat of Denton County. So how did a town that began with only 100 acres in 1857 become one of the fastest growing cities in Texas? The answer is not one highway, one university, or one sudden population boom. Denton's transformation began with a series of decisions and developments that unfolded over generations, and one of the first would arrive on iron rails. To understand Denton's rise, we have to go back to the middle of the 19th century, when North Texas was still a developing frontier. Denton County was organized in 1846, but the city of Denton itself did not yet exist. The future city was established in 1857, when Hiram Cisco, William Woodruff, and William Loving donated 100 acres for a new county seat near the center of the county. The town was named for John B. Denton, a Texas preacher, lawyer, soldier, and ranger who had been killed in 1841 during a military expedition against Native Americans. At first, there was nothing inevitable about Denton's future. The community grew slowly. In 1870, Denton had only 361 residents. 10 years later, that number had reached 1,194. The town's importance came less from industry than from its position as the county seat and as a local agricultural trading center. Farmers brought their crops and livestock into town, merchants supplied rural communities, and small businesses developed around the courthouse square. Flour mills, cotton-related businesses, blacksmith shops, and other small enterprises formed the foundation of the local economy. But Denton's greatest weakness was transportation. Before the railroad, distance determined opportunity. Farmers could produce crops, but reaching distant markets was difficult and expensive. Merchants could sell goods, but bringing those goods into town depended on slow overland transportation. Denton could function as a county seat, but becoming something much larger would require a connection to the outside economy. Then the railroad companies arrived. The first railroad reached Denton on April 1, 1881, when the Texas and Pacific Railway extended its line into the city. Another railroad connection followed through the Missouri, Kansas, and Texas system. Suddenly, Denton was no longer dependent solely on local roads and nearby agricultural trade. Farmers could move crops toward larger markets, merchants could receive goods more efficiently, and investors could see new possibilities in a town that had previously been limited by geography. The population numbers reveal just how powerful that change was. Denton grew from 1,194 people in 1880 to 2,558 in 1890, more than doubling in a single decade. The railroad had not magically created a major city, but it had changed the trajectory of the town. Yet there was a catch. The railroad gave Denton a connection, but not the kind of connection that would immediately turn it into a major industrial or wholesale center. Denton primarily had north-south rail connections, while the absence of a strong east-west railroad limited its ability to compete with some other Texas cities. And that limitation would matter, because Denton's future would depend on something even more powerful than the railroad: education, transportation, and its increasingly strategic position between Dallas and Fort Worth. The small town had survived its frontier beginnings. The railroad had opened the first door. But nobody in 1881 could yet see what would happen when the next century began, and when Denton's location would suddenly become one of its greatest assets. The railroad had opened the first door for Denton, but railroads alone could not determine what the city would become. By the beginning of the 20th century, another force was quietly taking root, one that would eventually change Denton more profoundly than the tracks running through the city. That force was education. In 1890, when Denton had only about 2,500 residents, Joshua C. Chilton established what became the University of North Texas. The first classes were held on September 16, 1890, above the B.J. Wilson hardware store near the courthouse square. At first, it was simply a small teacher training institution. But the decision to establish a college in Denton created something unusual for a small agricultural town, an institution capable of bringing people, money, ideas, and ambition into the community year after year. And Denton was only getting started. In 1903, another institution opened its doors. The school that began as Girls Industrial College would eventually become Texas Women's University. The state had selected Denton as its location in 1902, and when classes began in 1903, the college had 186 students and 14 faculty members. Two institutions were now growing inside a town whose economy had originally been built around farming, trade, and the county courthouse. That changed the city's identity. Students needed housing, teachers needed homes, businesses needed customers. Restaurants, stores, boarding houses, transportation services, and construction followed the expanding educational institutions. Denton was no longer merely a place where farmers came to conduct business. It was becoming a place where young people came to build futures. But education did not erase Denton's agricultural roots. During the first decades of the 20th century, farming remained central to the surrounding economy. Wheat and cotton dominated large areas of Denton County, and the railroads helped move agricultural products toward distant markets. Yet the same transportation system that had helped agriculture flourish also exposed one of Denton's limitations. The city was not becoming a major industrial center. Its rail connections were primarily north-south, and Denton lacked the broad east-west rail network that might have transformed it into a dominant wholesale or manufacturing hub. Instead, its future was gradually taking a different shape, one based on education, local commerce, and eventually transportation by automobile. Then came a transformation that would eventually make the railroad seem almost secondary: the automobile. After World War II, the geography of North Texas began changing rapidly. Roads gave people something railroads could not: flexibility. A person did not need to live beside a railroad station to travel. A business did not need to be located directly on a rail line to reach customers. And Denton's location suddenly mattered enormously. The city sits less than 40 miles north of Dallas and Fort Worth, along the corridor that would eventually become one of the most important transportation routes in North Texas. During World War II, Denton County began functioning increasingly as a bedroom area for the Dallas-Fort Worth region. Then the completion of Interstate 35 in the 1950s accelerated commuting and connected Denton more directly to the expanding metropolitan economy. Later, the interstate system would become even more significant when I-35E toward Dallas and I-35W toward Fort Worth forked in Denton. The numbers began revealing what was happening. In 1950, Denton's population was 21,372. By 1960, it had reached 26,844. Then the acceleration became impossible to ignore. By 1970, Denton had 39,874 residents. By 1980, the number had climbed to 48,063. In just 2 decades, the city had added more than 21,000 people. But the real surprise was not simply the number of newcomers. It was why they were coming. Some were connected to the universities. Others were attracted by employment and housing. Others could live in Denton while remaining connected to the much larger Dallas-Fort Worth economy. And the universities themselves were becoming enormous. By the 1980s, the combined enrollment of the 2 major universities approached 25,000 students, giving Denton a cultural and economic character unlike many other Texas cities of similar size. Growth was becoming self-reinforcing. More students meant more housing meant more construction. More residents meant more businesses meant more jobs and better transportation attracted still more residents. But every successful city eventually faces the same dangerous question. What happens when growth begins creating problems faster than a city can solve them? By the 1970s and 1980s, Denton was no longer simply growing. It was being pulled into the orbit of one of America's largest metropolitan regions. The old agricultural town was disappearing beneath new roads, homes, institutions, shopping centers, and expanding neighborhoods. In 1980, the opening of Golden Triangle Shopping Mall added another regional attraction, drawing shoppers from beyond Denton's immediate boundaries. The transformation was accelerating, but there was a hidden cost. The more valuable Denton became, the more pressure there would be to develop its land. The closer it became to Dallas-Fort Worth, the more people would want to live there. And the faster its population increased, the harder it would become to preserve the slower-paced identity that had defined the city for generations. Denton had spent more than a century trying to escape the limitations of a small agricultural town. Now it faced a completely different problem. It had finally become desirable, and success was about to change everything. By the beginning of the 21st century, Denton was no longer simply a college town surrounded by farmland. The forces that had been building for more than a century were now converging. Education had created a permanent population engine. Highways had connected Denton to Dallas and Fort Worth. Suburban development was pushing northward, and the land surrounding the city was becoming increasingly valuable. The transformation can be seen in the numbers. Denton had grown from 48,063 people in 1980 to 66,270 in 1990. By 2000, the population had reached 80,537. Then came another dramatic decade. The 2010 census recorded 113,383 residents. By 2020, Denton had reached 139,869. In roughly 40 years, the city had nearly tripled in population. But population was only part of the story. Denton was becoming increasingly integrated into the enormous economic system of North Texas. The city was positioned between Dallas and Fort Worth, with Interstate 35 providing a direct north-south connection. The highway system allowed residents to commute farther, businesses to reach larger markets, and developers to build housing across land that had once been primarily agricultural. This created a powerful cycle.
More people wanted to live in Denton. That increased demand for houses. New houses required roads, utilities, schools, shopping centers, restaurants, and services. Those developments created more economic activity. And that economic activity made Denton even more attractive. The process was no longer controlled by a single railroad company, a single university, or a group of local merchants. Denton had become part of something much larger. The Dallas-Fort Worth metropolitan area was expanding northward, and Denton was increasingly positioned directly in its path. That was the opportunity, but it was also the danger. The same growth that created prosperity began putting pressure on the city's infrastructure and identity. Land that had once been inexpensive farmland became development property. Open space became subdivisions. Traffic increased. Roads that had been designed for a smaller population had to serve a much larger one. And Denton faced a difficult question that many rapidly growing American cities eventually encounter. How do you remain the same place while becoming a completely different city? The answer was never going to be simple. Denton had something many rapidly expanding suburbs did not have: a powerful institutional and cultural identity built around its universities, historic downtown, music scene, neighborhoods, and long history as the county seat. The universities remained especially important. The University of North Texas and Texas Woman's University had transformed Denton decades earlier, and their influence continued into the 21st century.
What began in 1890 and 1903 as relatively small educational institutions had become fundamental parts of the city's economy and identity. And then came the newest wave of growth. Denton entered the 2020s as a city of nearly 140,000 people. At the same time, Denton County had become one of the major population growth centers of North Texas. The county increased from 662,614 residents in 2010 to 906,422 in 2020, and the Census Bureau estimated 1,069,346 residents in 2025, an increase of about 18% from the 2020 census base. Denton was benefiting from that regional explosion, but it was also being tested by it. Every new resident represented opportunity for a business, a developer, a university, or a local employer. Yet every new resident also meant another demand for housing, transportation, water, electricity, public services, and infrastructure. That is the paradox of Denton's success. The city spent generations trying to overcome the limitations of being small. Now its greatest challenge was managing the consequences of no longer being small. Look back at Denton in the late 19th century. In 1880, only 1,194 people lived there. The courthouse square was the center of community life. Agriculture dominated the surrounding landscape. The railroad represented the future. 40 years later, Denton had grown to 7,626 people. Another 30 years later, in 1950, it had reached 21,372. Then the highways and universities accelerated the process. By 1980, there were 48,063 residents. By 2010, more than 113,000, and by 2020, nearly 140,000. That is not simply population growth. It is a change in the role of a city. Denton began as a county seat. It became an agricultural trading center. then a railroad town, then a college town, then a regional transportation and employment center, and eventually an important component of the North Texas metropolitan economy. That is the real story behind Denton's rise. No single event created the modern city. The railroad created access. Education created an enduring economic and cultural foundation. Automobiles changed mobility. Interstate highways changed geography. Dallas and Fort Worth created regional economic pressure. Suburbanization brought new residents. And decades of investment turned Denton's location into an enormous advantage. But history rarely ends where a city reaches its peak. The very forces that made Denton successful are still operating. More people are arriving. More homes are being built. More businesses are looking north. More land is being transformed. And every new development raises the same question that Denton has faced in different forms for more than a century. What will this city become next? The farmers of the 1800s could not have imagined a city of nearly 140,000 people. The railroad builders of 1881 could not have imagined Interstate 35 carrying modern traffic through Denton. The educators who established the city's first colleges could not have imagined universities shaping the identity of an expanding North Texas city.
And the residents of Denton in 1950 could hardly have predicted how dramatically their small city would change within a single lifetime. Yet each generation unknowingly built part of the next Denton. A railroad track became a transportation network. A school became a university. A farm became a neighborhood. A local road became a regional highway. A small county seat became a major North Texas city. And that is why Denton's story is more than a story about population growth. It is the story of location, opportunity, ambition, and consequence. For more than 160 years, Denton kept changing because the world around it kept changing. The question now is no longer whether Denton can grow. History has already answered that. The real question is whether Denton can control what that growth makes it become. Because the next 100 years will not be written by the railroad builders, farmers, or pioneers who created the original town. They will be written by the people deciding what happens to Denton after success has already arrived.